Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it, and sometimes that chance comes from the most unlikely place you'd ever imagine. When 63-year-old Hank inherited his brother's property, he saw only a worthless, algae-choked lake locals called the Green Bowl. The aging cowboy, barely scraping by in a fading Texas town, planned to sell it for whatever he could get. But when his loyal dog Rusty dove into those murky waters one morning, everything changed. Beneath the surface lay thousands of fish, alive and thriving in the forgotten depths of an abandoned aquaculture project. What started as Hank's plan to get rid of a burden became his journey to bring life back to something everyone thought was dead. Along the way, he discovered that sometimes the things we inherit aren't curses, they're gifts waiting to be unwrapped. But would reviving this forgotten lake be enough to revive Hank's own forgotten dreams? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the weathered fence posts in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows across the dried grass that served as Hank Morrison's front yard. At 63, he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who'd learned to conserve energy for what mattered. His joints protested the Texas heat even at sunrise, but routine was routine, and the animals didn't care about old bones. Rusty, his 12-year-old Australian cattle dog, padded alongside him as they made their way to the small corral where 3 aging horses waited for their morning feed. The dog's coat had turned silver around the muzzle, matching his owner's grizzled beard, but his eyes still held the bright intelligence that had made him Hank's closest companion through the lean years. "Morning, girls," Hank murmured to the horses, his voice carrying the soft rasp of a man who'd spent decades breathing dust and speaking to animals more than people. The horses nickered in response, pressing their noses against the weathered rails as he measured out their feed. Every grain counted these days. Every dollar stretched. The small ranch outside Milbrook, Texas, barely qualified as a ranch anymore. 20 acres of stubborn grass and regret, with a house that needed new shingles, new plumbing, and about 15 years of deferred maintenance that Hank simply couldn't afford. The cattle were long gone, sold off piece by piece to cover mortgage, payments and medical bills. Now he survived on odd jobs, fence repairs for neighbors, and the monthly Social Security check that arrived like clockwork, but never quite covered everything. Rusty suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked toward the dusty road that led to town. A moment later, Hank heard it too, the rumble of an engine that didn't belong to any of his neighbors. A black sedan, impractical for ranch country, kicked up a cloud of dust as it approached. The lawyer who emerged from the car looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. His city shoes gathered dust with each step, and he kept glancing around, as if expecting something to jump out of the mesquite bushes. Hank recognized the type, someone who billed by the hour and considered trips outside metropolitan areas as hazardous duty. "Mr. Morrison, I'm David Chen from Chen, Blackwell and Associates. We spoke on the phone about your brother's estate." Hank nodded, remembering the awkward conversation 3 weeks ago. Ray had been dead for 2 months before anyone thought to track down his next of kin. Estrange didn't begin to cover the 20-year silence between the Morrison brothers, though. Lawyer pulled a manila envelope from his briefcase, its contents thick enough to suggest more complications than Hank had bargained for. "I have the will and property deed here. As I mentioned, your brother left you his entire estate." That was a generous way to describe what Ray had left behind. From what Hank had gathered during their brief phone conversation, his younger brother had lived as a recluse on a worthless piece of land north of town, surviving on disability payments and whatever odd income he could scrape together. Not exactly a fortune to inherit. "The property is about 15 minutes. And from here," Chen continued, consulting his notes, 47 acres, including what locals call the Green Bowl. I understand it's some sort of pond or small lake." Hank accepted the papers with hands that showed decades of rope burns and barbed wire scars. The will was straightforward enough. Everything to his only living relative, which happened to be Hank. The property deed revealed coordinates and lot numbers that meant nothing to him. But the description caught his attention, including all water rights, mineral rights, and improvements thereon. "Has anyone looked at this property recently?" Hank asked. Chen shifted uncomfortably. "I drove by it once. Honestly, Mr. Morrison, I'm not sure what your brother was thinking. The lake appears to be completely stagnant, covered in algae. The house is barely standing. There might be some salvage value in the land itself, but—" He shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes about his professional assessment. After the lawyer left, Hank sat on his front porch with Rusty at his feet, studying the deed as if it might reveal some hidden meaning. Ray Morrison had always been the dreamer in the family, full of schemes and big ideas that never quite panned out. Even as kids, Ray had been the one to build elaborate forts in the creek bed while Hank focused on practical things like chores and responsibilities. Their falling out had been as much about personality as circumstances. When their parents died in a car accident 15 years ago, Ray had wanted to keep the family farm running through some romantic notion of agricultural tradition. Hank had seen the numbers: mounting debt, declining cattle prices, and equipment that needed more money than they could hope to make. The argument that followed had been ugly, final, and apparently permanent. Now Ray was gone, and whatever dreams he'd been chasing on that property had died with him. The drive to the inherited land took Hank through the heart of Milbrook, a town that seemed to shrink a little more each year. Main Street showed gaps where businesses used to be: the hardware store that couldn't compete with the big box chains an hour away, the diner that closed when old Pete finally retired, the bank that got absorbed by some corporation nobody had ever heard of. Mrs. Patterson at the post office waved as he drove past. She'd probably heard about Ray's death through the small-town network that made official announcements redundant. In a place like Milbrook, everyone knew everyone else's business, which made Hank's solitary lifestyle something of an oddity. The property sat at the end of a dirt road that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years. Mesquite and cedar had begun reclaiming the edges, and Hank had to get out twice to move fallen branches out of the way. Rusty rode in the passenger seat with his nose out the window, alert to every new scent and sound. The house, when it finally came into view, lived down to the lawyer's description. A small frame structure that might have been white once upon a time, now weathered to the color of old bones. The roof sagged in the middle, and several windows were boarded up. A detached barn in slightly better condition stood about 50 yards away. Its red paint faded, but its structure sound. But it was the lake that drew Hank's attention. The green bowl stretched out behind the house, like a mirror someone had forgotten to clean. Perhaps 2 acres of water, completely covered in a thick mat of algae that gave it an otherworldly green color. The smell hit him as soon as he stepped out of the truck. Stagnant water and decomposing vegetation, with an undertone of something else he couldn't quite identify. Rusty jumped down from the truck and immediately began exploring, his nose to the ground as he traced invisible trails only he could detect. But when he reached the water's edge, his behavior changed. Instead of his usual quick investigation and dismissal, he stood perfectly still, head tilted, as if listening to something only he could hear. "What is it, boy?" Hank asked, following his dog to the lake's edge. The water was completely opaque beneath its green blanket. No telling how deep it went or what lay beneath. Local teenagers had probably used it for swimming once upon a time, but that would have been years ago, before the algae took over. Hank walked the perimeter, trying to get a sense of the lake's scope and condition. The banks were solid enough, lined with native stone that suggested some human engineering in the distant past. Water levels seemed consistent, fed by a creek that entered on the north side and exited through a small spillway. On the south, Despite the algae, the basic infrastructure of a healthy lake remained intact. Rusty had followed him around the entire perimeter, but kept returning to the same spot on the eastern shore. He'd stand there for minutes at a time, perfectly motionless except for the slight tremor in his tail that Hank had learned to recognize as intense concentration. "Nothing there but green soup, old boy," Hank said, but he found himself studying the water more carefully. Was there something different about this particular spot? The algae seemed slightly thinner here, or maybe it was just his imagination. The house tour didn't take long. 3 small rooms and a kitchen that belonged in a museum. No electricity, though the wiring suggested it had been connected at some point. A wood-burning stove for heat, a hand pump for water from what appeared to be a private well. Ray had been living like a homesteader, apparently by choice rather than necessity. The barn proved more interesting. While the house spoke of abandonment, the barn showed signs of recent use. Workbenches lined one wall, clean and organized. Tools hung in precise arrangements. Stacks of lumber, coils of wire, and various mechanical devices Hank couldn't immediately identify. In the corner, almost hidden behind a tarp, sat a stack of cardboard boxes. The top one was labeled in Ray's careful handwriting, Lake Project Phase 1. Hank lifted the flap and found himself looking at scientific journals, extension service publications, and what appeared to be correspondence with various state agencies. The papers were organized with the obsessive care of someone pursuing a serious research project. Whatever Ray had been planning for that green pond, he'd approached it with the methodical attention of an engineer rather than a dreamer. But that investigation would have to wait. The day was growing warm, and Hank had his own animals to tend. Back home, he whistled for Rusty, who reluctantly left his position by the lake and trotted back to the truck. As they drove away, Hank found himself thinking about possibilities rather than problems. 47 acres wasn't much by Texas standards, but it was more than enough for a man who currently owned 20. The lake might be a mess now, but water was water, and water had value in a state where drought was always one season away. Maybe Ray hadn't been such a dreamer after all. Maybe he'd just been ahead of his time. That evening, as Hank sat on his own porch watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of orange and red, he found himself holding the property deed and thinking about second chances. At 63, he'd assumed his major life decisions were behind him, but perhaps that assumption had been premature. Rusty lay at his feet, but even in sleep, his ears twitched occasionally toward the north, toward the property they'd visited that day. Dreams of hidden waters, perhaps, or whatever he'd sensed beneath that green surface. In the morning, Hank decided he'd make some phone calls, find out what Ray had really been up to in those final years. Maybe even drive back out to take another look at the green bowl. After all, what else did he have to do? 3 days later, Hank found himself back at the green bowl with a thermos of coffee and a growing sense of curiosity about his brother's final project. The boxes in the barn had kept him up past midnight, revealing layer after layer of Ray's meticulous research into aquaculture, water management, and fish farming techniques that seemed far more sophisticated than anything Hank would have expected from his reclusive brother. The morning was crisp for late September, with a hint of the autumn that would eventually break Texas's stubborn hold on summer. Rusty had been unusually restless during the drive, pacing back and forth in the truck bed and whining in a way that suggested anticipation rather than anxiety. Hank parked near the barn and let Rusty out, watching as the dog immediately headed for the lake with purposeful strides. Whatever had captured his attention during their first visit clearly hadn't left his memory. The algae seemed thicker today, if such a thing were possible. The entire surface looked like a green carpet that might support a person's weight, though. Hank had no intention of testing that theory. The smell was stronger too, though whether from yesterday's rain or some other factor, he couldn't say. He'd brought along a long-handled net he'd found in the barn, thinking he might try to clear a small section of the algae to get a better look at the water beneath. The scientific journals had mentioned the importance of light penetration for aquatic ecosystems, and it stood to reason that whatever Ray had been planning would require cleaner water than what currently existed. Rusty had taken up his now familiar position at the eastern edge of the lake, but his behavior was different today. Instead of the still concentration he'd shown before, he was pacing back and forth along a 10-foot stretch of shoreline, occasionally looking back at Hank as if waiting for permission or encouragement. "What's got into you, boy?" Hank asked. Setting down his coffee and joining the dog at the water's edge, Rusty looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, then back at the water, then at Hank again. The message was unmistakable. Something was down there, and he wanted to investigate. "That water's not fit for swimming," Hank told him. "We don't know what kind of bacteria might be—" Before he could finish the thought, Rusty had made his decision. With a determined leap that belied his 12 years, he launched himself off the bank and into the algae-covered water, with a splash that sent green mats flying in all directions. "Rusty, no!" Hank shouted, rushing to the water's edge as his dog disappeared beneath the surface. The lake was deeper than it looked. Rusty's initial splash had opened a hole in the algae that revealed dark water extending down beyond sight. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing but ripples and the slowly closing gap in the green carpet. Then Rusty's head burst through the surface 20 feet from shore, swimming with strong strokes toward the center of the lake as if he'd found exactly what he was looking for. Hank waded into the shallows, his boots immediately sinking into soft mud that released clouds of disturbed sediment. "Rusty, get back here!" But the dog was on a mission. He dove beneath the surface again, staying down for what seemed like an impossibly long time before emerging with something silver flashing in his mouth. Without hesitation, he turned and began swimming back toward shore, his prize held high, above the waterline. When Rusty finally reached the shallows and bounded up the bank, shaking algae and mud from his coat, Hank could see what he'd retrieved. A fish. Not a small minnow or bottom feeder, but a substantial base that had to weigh at least 2 pounds, very much alive and struggling with the vigor of a healthy, well-fed fish. Hank stared in disbelief as Rusty dropped the base at his feet. The fish flopped on the grass for a moment before Hank's instincts kicked in, and he quickly carried it back to the water's edge, gently releasing it into the shallows where it immediately darted back toward deeper water. "How in the hell—" Hank began, then stopped himself. The evidence was undeniable. There were fish in this lake, living, thriving fish, despite the algae-choked surface that made the water look like a biological disaster. Rusty was already back, in the water, diving again, with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd finally been given permission to do what he'd wanted to do all along. This time, he stayed down even longer, emerging with another fish. This one smaller, but equally healthy-looking. Hank found himself knee-deep in the lake without remembering how he'd gotten there, reaching for the fish Rusty had caught. As he held it briefly before release, he could feel the solid weight of good muscle, the kind that came from a fish that had never known hunger or stress. This wasn't a fish that had been merely surviving in polluted water. This was a fish that had been thriving. Over the next hour, Rusty retrieved 7 more fish of various sizes, bass, catfish, and what looked like bluegill, all showing the same signs of health and vitality. Each time, Hank examined them briefly before returning them to the water, his amazement growing with each catch. The implications were staggering. Somehow, beneath the algae that made the lake appear dead, an entire ecosystem was not just surviving, but flourishing. The fish weren't gasping for oxygen or showing signs of disease. They were fat, healthy, and apparently numerous enough that Rusty could catch them with relative ease. When Rusty finally tired of his game and paddled back to shore, both dog and man were covered in algae and mud. But Hank didn't care. His mind was racing with questions and possibilities that he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. He spent the rest of the morning in Ray's barn, digging deeper into the research boxes with new urgency. The picture that emerged was both fascinating and heartbreaking. Ray hadn't been living as a hermit by choice. He'd been conducting what appeared to be a serious scientific experiment in sustainable aquaculture. The journals revealed a carefully planned project that had begun nearly 8 years ago. Ray had stocked the lake with fingerlings from a state fish hatchery, installed aeration systems to maintain oxygen levels, and developed a feeding program based on natural food sources rather than commercial fish food. The algae, rather than being a sign of neglect, was apparently part of the design, a natural filter system that kept the water clean while providing cover and food for the fish population. Letters from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department showed that Ray had been working with state biologists on what they termed an innovative approach to low-impact fish farming. His disability payments had been supplemented by small grants for environmental research, and his careful records showed steady growth in both fish population and average size over the years. The most recent entries, dated just 3 months before Ray's death, indicated that he'd been preparing to harvest his first commercial crop. Market research showed strong demand for locally raised, sustainably produced fish among Austin restaurants and farmers' markets. Ray had been on the verge of transforming his experiment into a profitable business, but then his heart had given out, and 8 years of careful planning had died with him. Hank sat in the barn as the afternoon sun slanted through dusty windows, holding a detailed business plan that showed projected revenues, expansion possibilities, and long-term sustainability. Projections. Ray's careful handwriting filled margin after margin with notes and calculations that revealed not a dreamer, but a methodical scientist who'd been planning for the future. At the bottom of the last page, in pencil so faint Hank almost missed it, Ray had written, "Maybe Hank was right about being practical, but maybe practical can also mean sustainable." It was the closest thing to an apology Ray would ever be able to give. Outside, Rusty was lying in the shade of the truck, still damp from his morning adventure, but looking more satisfied than Hank had seen him in months. The dog's instincts had been better than human observation. He'd sensed life beneath the deceptive surface and acted on faith rather than appearance. As Hank loaded the research boxes into his truck, he found himself thinking about phone calls he needed to make and people he should contact. The lawyer had mentioned salvage value and quick sale, but what if there was something more valuable here than anyone had realized? What if Ray's legacy wasn't worthless land, but a functioning business that just needed someone to recognize its potential? The drive home was quiet except for the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional satisfied sigh from Rusty in the passenger seat. But Hank's mind was anything but quiet. For the first time in years, he was thinking about the future, rather than just surviving the present. By the time he reached his own driveway, he'd made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. He wasn't going to sell the property, not yet. Not until he understood exactly what his brother had accomplished in those green waters. Maybe it was time to find out what 20 years of silence had cost both Morrison brothers. The barn held more secrets than Hank had initially realized. What he'd taken for a simple storage area behind the stacked lumber turned out to be something approaching a proper office, complete with a desk fashioned from sawhorses and plywood, file cabinets made from wooden crates, and a bulletin board covered with photographs, charts, and hand-drawn diagrams. Ray had created a meticulous record of his 8-year project, and as Hank worked through the materials over the following week, a picture emerged of a man who'd been far more methodical and knowledgeable than anyone in Milbrook had given him credit for. The research notes were organized by year and topic: water chemistry, fish nutrition, breeding cycles, market analysis, and equipment maintenance. Ray's handwriting was small and precise, filling notebook after notebook with observations, measurements, and carefully documented experiments. He'd tracked water temperature, pH levels, dissolved oxygen content, and fish growth rates with the dedication of a professional scientist. One folder contained correspondence with experts from Texas A&M University, Auburn University, and the USDA's Aquaculture Research Program. Ray hadn't been working in isolation. He'd been part of a larger community of researchers exploring sustainable fish farming techniques. Several professors had visited the property, and their letters praised Ray's innovative approach to natural ecosystem management, but it was the personal journal hidden in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet that hit Hank like a physical blow. "Year 3, one entry read. System is stabilizing better than projected. Fish are healthy, water quality improving. Hank would probably say I'm chasing another pipe dream, but the numbers don't lie. Maybe if I'd listened to him about the farm, we could have tried this together. Maybe if I hadn't been so stubborn about proving I could make something work on my own." Another entry dated 2 years later. "Drove past Hank's place today. Wanted to stop, show him what I've accomplished. Wanted to tell him he was right about needing to be practical, but that practical doesn't have to mean giving up. Lost my nerve at the mailbox. 20 years is a long time to let pride get in the way." Hank had to set the journal aside and walk. Outside, where Rusty was investigating the foundation of an old chicken coop. The guilt was sharper than he'd expected, cutting through years of justified anger and righteous stubbornness to expose the simple truth. Both brothers had been too proud to take the first step toward reconciliation. Ray's final entries, written in the months before his death, revealed plans that would have made Hank proud. His brother had been preparing to approach local restaurants about purchasing fresh fish, had contacted the Agricultural Extension Service about educational programs, and had even sketched out plans for a small visitor center where people could learn about sustainable aquaculture. "If this works," Ray had written, "maybe I'll finally have something worth sharing with Hank. Maybe it's not too late to show him that practical and passionate don't have to be opposites." But it had been too late, and now Hank was left holding his brother's dreams and wondering what he was supposed to do with them. The first attempt to clear a section of algae proved more challenging than Hank had anticipated. The green mat was thicker and more established than it appeared, and his initial efforts with rakes and nets only seemed to spread it around rather than remove it. But Ray's notes provided guidance here too, detailing a gradual approach that maintained the lake's ecological balance while improving water clarity. According to the research, the algae served multiple functions in Ray's system. It provided natural filtration, produced oxygen through photosynthesis, and served as a food source for the fish. The goal wasn't elimination, but management, creating areas of open water while preserving the algae's beneficial functions. Working slowly and methodically, Hank managed to clear a 20-foot section near the eastern shore, where Rusty had first detected the fish. With the green carpet removed, he could see down into surprisingly clear water that revealed a well-designed bottom structure of gravel beds and artificial reefs made from stacked stones. The fish were immediately visible in the cleared area. Dozens of them, ranging from fingerlings to mature adults, moving with the lazy confidence of animals that had never known predation or scarcity. Watching them, Hank began to understand what Ray had accomplished. This wasn't just a pond with fish in. It was a functioning ecosystem designed to sustain itself indefinitely. Word of Hank's activities had reached Milbrook through the efficient small-town communication network that made privacy nearly impossible. When he stopped at Murphy's feed store for supplies, the conversations that had been flowing freely when he entered died to uncomfortable silence. "Heard you're fixing to clean up that old lake," Murphy said, as he rang up Hank's purchase of water testing equipment. "Lot of work for something you're planning to sell." "Might not be selling," Hank replied, which produced an exchange of glances between the other customers that spoke volumes about their opinion of that decision. "Ray spent years fooling around out there," offered Bill Hendricks from the back of the store. "Never came to anything. Some things are better left alone." Hank didn't argue, but he could feel the weight of skeptical stares as he loaded his supplies. In a town where practical decisions were valued above dreams, his choice to invest time and effort in Ray's abandoned project marked him as either foolishly optimistic or slightly unhinged. The one exception came from an unexpected source. Sarah Chen, the librarian at Milbrook's small public library, approached him as he was leaving Murphy's. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Sarah Chen. I knew your brother." She was probably in her late 40s, with graying dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her voice carried the slight accent of someone who'd grown up bilingual, and her manner was direct without being intrusive. "Ray used to come in regularly to use our internet connection. For his research," she continued. "He was always very excited about his fish project. I helped him find articles from agricultural journals and connect with experts online." This was the first person Hank had met who spoke of Ray's work with respect rather than dismissive tolerance. "He showed me pictures once," Sarah said. "The fish he was raising, the water quality improvements. It was impressive work, very scientific, very well planned." "You're about the only person in town who seems to think so," Hank replied. Sarah smiled. "Small towns don't always appreciate innovation until it proves successful." Ray knew that. He was planning to invite some of the local restaurant owners to see his operation once he was ready for market. He thought seeing the results would change their minds. She paused, studying Hank's face with the careful attention of someone who spent her days helping people find information they needed. "If you're planning to continue his work, I still have copies of some of the research he was doing. And I know the contact information for several of the experts he was corresponding with. They were quite impressed with what he'd accomplished." It was the first concrete offer of help Hank had received, and it came from someone who understood the value of what Ray had been trying to do. "I'd appreciate that," Hank said. "I'm still trying to figure out exactly what he had in mind." "Ray was always very specific about his goals," Sarah replied. "He wanted to prove that small-scale, sustainable agriculture could work in rural areas. He thought it might provide a model for other communities facing economic challenges." As Hank drove home, he found himself thinking about vision and legacy, about the difference between dreams and plans. Ray hadn't been chasing fantasies. He'd been building something real and sustainable, something that could outlast the man who created it. The question now was whether Hank had the courage to continue what his brother had started. Sarah's research. Materials proved invaluable, but it was an old fishing net hanging in the barn's rafters that transformed Hank's theoretical knowledge into practical understanding. The net had obviously been hand-repaired multiple times, its original weave reinforced with newer twine in a patchwork pattern that spoke of years of careful maintenance. According to Ray's notes, the net had belonged to their grandfather, who'd used it for commercial fishing on the Gulf before moving inland to try his hand at farming. Ray had adapted it for his aquaculture project, using it to move fish between sections of the lake during his breeding experiments. The net's construction was more sophisticated than modern versions Hank had seen. Weighted bottom line, carefully balanced floats, and a mesh size designed to capture mature fish while allowing smaller ones to escape. When Hank finally worked up the courage to try using it, with Rusty swimming alongside to guide the fish, the results were remarkable. The fish practically guided themselves into the net. Years of conditioning to Ray's handling had made them surprisingly cooperative, and within an hour Hank had successfully captured, examined and released over 30 fish of various sizes. Each one showed the healthy coloration and robust build that indicated proper nutrition and minimal stress. "Your brother trained them well," Sarah observed from the shoreline where she'd come to deliver additional research materials. She'd become a regular visitor to the property, bringing information and staying to help with whatever project Hank was tackling that day. "Trained fish?" Hank asked, carefully releasing a 2-pound bass back into the water. Ray spent years working with them. He could call them to feeding areas, guide them into different sections of the lake for breeding, even get them to come to the surface for health checks. It was remarkable to watch. Sarah had brought historical documents that provided context, For the lake's original purpose, the property had been developed in the 1940s as a small resort, with the lake serving as the centerpiece for fishing and swimming. But economic changes in the 1960s had forced its closure, and subsequent owners had allowed the lake to revert to a natural state. Ray wasn't trying to create something new, Sarah explained as they walked the perimeter, noting areas where algae management was most needed. He was trying to restore what had been here before, but with modern understanding of ecological balance. The revelation changed Hank's perspective on the project. Rather than an experiment, Ray had been engaged in restoration, bringing life back to something that had once thrived. The idea resonated with Hank's own sense of loss and renewal, the possibility that damaged things could be made whole again with patience and proper care. Rusty had become an essential partner in the daily work. The dog seemed to understand the project's goals instinctively, swimming out to guide fish toward areas where Hank was working, alerting him to problems with water flow or unusual fish behavior, and somehow managing to avoid disrupting the delicate ecosystem Ray had created. "He's a natural herder," Sarah said, watching Rusty gently guide a school of bluegill away from a section where Hank was adjusting one of the aerators. "Border collies do the same thing with sheep, Australian cattle dog," Hank corrected automatically. But he was beginning to see the parallel. Rusty wasn't just swimming for fun, he was working, applying instincts developed over generations of selective breeding to a new but related challenge. The financial reality of continuing Ray's project remained sobering. Even with all the infrastructure in place, maintaining the lake required ongoing investment in equipment, feed supplements, and water quality management. Hank's savings were modest, and his monthly expenses barely left room for luxuries, much less major capital improvements. The alternative, selling the property, became more complicated as real estate values emerged. A local developer had expressed interest in the land for a residential subdivision, offering enough money to secure Hank's retirement and eliminate his financial worries permanently. 47 acres with water rights in this market, the developer had explained during a phone conversation. "We could put 15 to 20 homes on it easily. The lake would make a nice centerpiece for the community." But the developer's vision of a manicured pond surrounded by suburban lawns bore no resemblance to the functioning ecosystem Ray had spent 8 years creating. The fish, the carefully balanced water chemistry, the natural filtration systems, all of it would be destroyed in favor of aesthetic appeal and property values. Sarah found Hank sitting by the lake one evening, watching the sunset reflect off the newly cleared sections of water, where fish occasionally rose to feed on insects. "Ray struggled with the same decision," she said, settling onto the grass beside him. "Several times over the years, people approached him about selling. The money would have solved his immediate problems. What changed his mind? I think he realized the lake was bigger than his personal situation. He used to say it was proof that sustainable approaches could work, that rural communities didn't have to choose between economic survival and environmental responsibility." That night, Hank made his first significant breakthrough in water quality management. Following Ray's detailed instructions, he introduced beneficial bacteria to accelerate algae decomposition in targeted areas while preserving the algae's positive functions in others. The results were visible within days, patches of clear water that revealed the lake's depth and structure while maintaining the natural cover the fish required. Standing knee-deep in water, clear enough to see his boots, Hank felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pride in work that mattered beyond immediate necessity. The fish swimming around his legs showed no fear, treating him as a familiar part of their environment. The lake that had seemed dead and worthless just weeks earlier was revealing itself as a complex, thriving ecosystem that responded to care and attention. Murphy's feed store provided a barometer of changing community attitudes. Where skeptical silence had greeted Hank's initial purchases, He now encountered cautious curiosity and occasional offers of help. "Heard you got that lake clearing up some," Murphy mentioned as he rang up an order of water testing supplies. "Bill Hendricks drove out there yesterday, said he could actually see fish swimming around." "They've been there all along," Hank replied. "Just needed better visibility." "Ray always claimed there was something special about that water," offered Mrs. Patterson, who'd come in for chicken feed. Nobody believed him, but maybe he knew what he was talking about. The comments weren't quite endorsements, but they represented a shift from dismissive skepticism to cautious interest. In a community where change came slowly, that represented significant progress. As Hank loaded his supplies into the truck, Rusty waiting patiently in the passenger seat, he found himself thinking about momentum and commitment. The lake project had reached a critical point where further progress required genuine investment of time, money, and reputation. Ray had faced the same choice and chosen to believe in possibilities rather than limitations. The question now was whether Hank had inherited his brother's vision along with his property, or whether practical concerns would ultimately override the pull of restoration and renewal. The answer, he suspected, lay somewhere beneath the surface of the green bowl, waiting to be discovered by someone willing to dive deep enough to find it. The water quality testing kit arrived on a Tuesday morning, its precise instruments and calibrated solutions representing a level of scientific rigor that Hank had never applied to ranch work. But as he learned to interpret pH readings, dissolved oxygen levels and nitrogen content, he began to see parallels between managing aquatic systems and the land management skills he'd developed over decades. Dr. Jennifer Martinez from the state Agricultural Extension Office had driven down from Austin to assess the lake's potential, bringing equipment that made Hank's basic testing kit look primitive. A compact woman with weathered hands and the practical manner of someone who spent more time outdoors than in offices. She'd worked with Ray during the early years of his project. "Your brother was ahead of his time," she said, recording water temperature measurements at various depths. "Most aquaculture operations focus on maximum production with artificial systems. Ray designed something that worked with natural processes instead of fighting them." The testing revealed a complexity that surprised even Dr. Martinez. The lake supported 5 different fish species in carefully balanced populations, with each species occupying a specific ecological niche that contributed to overall system health. Bass provided predation control, catfish managed bottom sediments, bluegill controlled insect populations, and 2 species of sunfish. Hank couldn't identify served functions he was still learning to understand. "This isn't fish farming," Dr. Martinez explained as they watched Rusty guide a school of juvenile bass away from their sampling area. "This is ecosystem management. Ray created a self-sustaining community that produces food while maintaining environmental health." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and she'd already made calls to colleagues at Texas A&M and the Natural Resources Conservation Service about documenting Ray's methods for wider application. The possibility that the lake might serve as a model for other rural communities added weight to Hank's decision-making process. The first volunteers appeared the following weekend. Sarah had mentioned the project to members of the Hill Country Environmental Alliance, and 4 people arrived on Saturday morning with offers to help with whatever needed doing. They brought expertise Hank lacked: a retired biology teacher who could identify aquatic plants, a hydrologist who understood water flow patterns, and 2 enthusiastic retirees who simply wanted to contribute to something meaningful. "We've been looking for local projects that demonstrate sustainable practices," explained Carol Voss, the group's coordinator. "What you're doing here could be significant beyond just this property." Hank found himself coordinating efforts and assigning tasks. With the same natural authority he'd used managing ranch hands in earlier years. The skills translated surprisingly well, understanding individual capabilities, organizing work sequences, and maintaining focus on long-term goals while handling immediate problems. His ranching background proved particularly valuable in managing the lake's feeding systems. Ray's notes described complex schedules and nutrient calculations, but Hank recognized the underlying principles from livestock management. Feed conversion ratios, growth rates, and health monitoring followed familiar patterns, just applied to different species. The breakthrough came when Hank realized he could adapt rotational grazing concepts to fish management. By creating temporary barriers within the lake, he could move fish populations between different sections, allowing vegetation and water quality to recover while maintaining optimal stocking densities. "It's brilliant," Dr. Martinez said when Hank explained his adaptation of cattle rotation principles. "You're giving the ecosystem rest periods while maximizing productive capacity." Ray would have loved this, but success brought new challenges. As word spread about the lake's restoration, local interest increased beyond Hank's capacity to manage. People began stopping by unannounced, asking for tours, requesting permission to fish, and offering suggestions that ranged from helpful to absurd. The crisis came during the third week of October, when an unexpected warm spell triggered a massive algae bloom in the section of Lake Hank had been most proud of clearing. Overnight, clear water turned green again, oxygen levels dropped dangerously, and fish began showing signs of stress. Hank's first instinct was to tackle the problem alone, working 18-hour days with chemical treatments and mechanical aeration. But the bloom was too extensive for one person to handle, and his efforts were making minimal impact while exhausting his energy and resources. Sarah found him on a Thursday evening, slumped on the shore beside testing equipment that showed continuing deterioration in water quality. Rusty lay beside him, both of them displaying the defeated posture of workers who'd reached the limits of their capabilities. "You can't do this alone," Sarah said simply. "Ray learned that lesson too. That's why he reached out to experts, why he documented everything so carefully. He knew the project was bigger than one person." The call for help went out that night, through the environmental group's network, and by Saturday morning, 15 people had arrived with equipment, expertise, and the energy to mount a coordinated response to the algae crisis. Working in shifts around the clock, they implemented an emergency management plan that combined chemical treatment, mechanical aeration, and careful relocation of fish to unaffected areas. Watching strangers work late into the night to save something they'd only recently learned about, Hank felt a humbling recognition of how much his isolation had cost him. Pride and self-reliance had their place, but some challenges required community response. "Your brother understood this," Dr. Martinez said as they monitored oxygen levels during the critical third night of treatment. His later notes talk about building networks, sharing knowledge, creating support systems. He knew the lake's success depended on more than just good management. By Monday morning, the crisis had passed. Water quality measurements showed steady improvement, fish behavior returned to normal, and the cleared sections maintained their clarity despite the temporary setback. But more importantly, the emergency had established working relationships that transformed the lake project from Hank's private restoration effort into a community initiative. The testing kit that had started as a tool for individual monitoring became the foundation for ongoing scientific documentation. Volunteers established regular sampling schedules, data recording systems, and communication protocols that ensured problems would be detected and addressed before they became crises. Standing beside the lake on a cool October evening, watching volunteers pack equipment after the successful resolution of the algae bloom, Hank felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being part of something larger than himself. The isolation that had defined his life since his parents' death was beginning to dissolve, replaced by connections built around shared purpose and mutual respect. Rusty emerged from the water with a satisfied shake, having spent the evening doing what he did best, guiding fish and monitoring the underwater world that had become his domain. The dog's contentment reflected the lake's return to health, a visible reminder that sometimes the best solutions came from trusting instincts and accepting help from unexpected sources. The lake that had seemed like a burden just 2 months earlier was revealing itself as a gift that kept expanding, creating opportunities for connection, learning, and purpose that Hank had never imagined possible. The letter was tucked inside Ray's final research notebook, sealed in an envelope that bore Hank's name in his brother's careful handwriting. Sarah found it while organizing the scientific documents for the Extension Office's official review, and she brought it to Hank on a quiet Sunday morning when he was working alone at the lake. "I think Ray meant for you to find this," she said, handing him the envelope with the solemnity of someone delivering last words. Hank's hands shook slightly as he opened it. 20 years of silence hung between him and whatever his brother had wanted to say, and he wasn't sure he was ready for whatever forgiveness or recrimination might be waiting inside. The letter was dated 3 months before Ray's death, written in pencil on lined notebook paper. "Hank," it began, "I've been working up the courage to write this for 8 years. Every time I drive past your place, I think about stopping, but pride gets in the way. Seems like pride has been getting in the way of a lot of things between us. You were right about the farm. I know that now. We couldn't have saved it, and trying would have just prolonged the suffering. But I need you to understand why I couldn't see it then. When Mom and Dad died, that farm was all I had left of them. Selling it felt like erasing their memory, like admitting their lives didn't matter. This lake project started as another one of my crazy schemes, I'll admit, but somewhere along the way, it became something else. It became proof that we could honor their memory by creating something sustainable, something that would last beyond our lifetimes. They taught us to take care of the land, to think about future generations. I just took longer than you to figure out how to do that practically. I've been documenting everything because I hope someday you'll see what I've built here. Not as another failed dream, but as something worth continuing. The fish don't care about our arguments. The water doesn't hold grudges. This place could bring life to our community long after we're gone, if someone with your good sense takes care of it. I miss you, brother. I miss the talks we used to have, the way you could see through my nonsense to the useful parts underneath. I know I was stubborn. I know I made mistakes, but I hope when you see this place, you'll understand what I was trying to do. The lake works because I finally learned to listen, to the water, to the fish, to people who knew more than I did. Maybe it's not too late for us to learn to listen to each other again. Your brother always, Ray." Hank had to set the letter down and walk to the water's edge, where Rusty was lying in the shade of the equipment shed. The dog lifted his head as Hank approached, recognizing distress in his owner's posture and offering the silent comfort that had sustained them both through difficult years. Reading Ray's words, Hank finally understood the true scope of his brother's vision. The aquaculture project hadn't been about proving anything to skeptical neighbors or generating income for personal gain. It had been about creating a legacy that honored their parents' values while providing practical benefits for future generations. The irony wasn't lost on him. Ray had spent years learning to balance passion with practicality, while Hank had been so focused on practical concerns that he'd forgotten the importance of purpose beyond immediate survival. That afternoon, Dr. Martinez arrived with a team of graduate students to conduct the comprehensive assessment that would determine the lake's potential for official recognition as a demonstration site. But their scientific work was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. James Wheeler represented Highland Development Corporation, and his presence at the lake signaled a shift in the external pressures surrounding the property. Dressed in expensive outdoor gear that had clearly never seen actual outdoor work, Wheeler carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you've been improving the property," Wheeler said, gesturing toward the cleared sections of lake where Dr. Martinez's students were collecting water samples. "That's excellent. It shows the potential we've been discussing. Highland Development had been quietly purchasing properties throughout the county for a master-planned community that would transform the rural area into an upscale suburb for Austin commuters. The lake property represented a key piece of their development puzzle, and Wheeler had come prepared to make an offer that would be difficult to refuse. "We're prepared to exceed our previous offer by 30%, Wheeler continued, "plus a significant bonus for expedited closing. I understand you've invested time and effort in this lake project, but our development will include a much larger recreational lake that would serve hundreds of families." Dr. Martinez looked up from her equipment, her expression suggesting she'd encountered Wheeler's type before. "Mr. Morrison's lake isn't just recreational. It's a functioning ecosystem that produces food while maintaining environmental health. Highland's development would destroy 8 years of ecological work." Wheeler's smile remained professional, but his tone sharpened. "I'm sure it's very interesting from a scientific perspective, but practical considerations have to take precedence. Rural communities need economic development, not science experiments." The confrontation that followed revealed battle lines that extended far beyond individual property decisions. Wheeler represented development interests that viewed rural land as empty space waiting to be improved through construction and population growth. Dr. Martinez and her colleagues saw the same land as complex ecosystems that provided services difficult to replace once destroyed. Hank found himself in the middle of competing visions for the region's future, each side assuming his support based on their interpretation of his practical nature. Sarah's arrival shifted the dynamic in ways that surprised everyone, including Hank. Her knowledge of local history and environmental law, combined with her diplomatic skills, transformed a confrontational meeting into a productive discussion about alternatives that might serve multiple interests. The lake could anchor ecotourism development, she suggested, educational programs, sustainable agriculture demonstrations, recreational fishing that doesn't require massive infrastructure investment. Highland could develop surrounding properties while preserving the lake as a community resource. Watching Sarah navigate the complex conversation, presenting options and finding common ground, Hank felt a growing appreciation for her intelligence and judgment that went beyond their working relationship on the lake project. She understood the value of what Ray had created, but she also recognized the legitimate concerns of people who needed economic opportunities. That evening, as Wheeler left with promises to consider alternative development approaches, Hank and Sarah walked the lake perimeter with Rusty moving more slowly than usual beside them. The dog's age was showing in stiff joints and a reluctance to swim in the cooler weather, reminders that time moved differently for different species. "Ray would have liked your compromise proposal," Hank told Sarah as they stopped at the spot where Rusty had first discovered the fish. "I learned negotiation from library budget meetings," Sarah replied with a smile. "Sometimes the best solution is the one nobody thought of initially." Standing beside the water in the gathering dusk, watching fish rise to feed in the gathering twilight, Hank realized the lake project had become something larger than Ray's scientific experiment or his own restoration effort. It had become a focal point for community discussions about values, priorities, and the kind of future they wanted to create together. The question now was whether that future would honor Ray's vision of sustainable development or succumb to the pressure of economic forces that measured value primarily in monetary terms. The original land survey documents arrived by certified mail on a Thursday that would change everything. Sarah had requested them from the county clerk's office as part of her research into the property's history, expecting to find routine boundary descriptions and water rights documentation. Instead, she discovered papers that revealed why James Wheeler had been so persistent in his purchase offers. "You need to see this," Sarah said, spreading the survey maps across the makeshift table in Ray's barn office. Her voice carried an urgency. that brought Hank hurrying from the lake where he'd been monitoring the aerator systems. The mineral rights documentation was extensive and detailed, showing geological surveys conducted in the 1970s that had identified significant limestone deposits throughout the property. But more shocking was the recent geological assessment, dated just 6 months earlier, that confirmed the presence of high-grade limestone suitable for commercial quarrying operations. Highland Development isn't just interested in building houses, Sarah explained, pointing to notations on the survey maps. They're representing Southwestern Quarry Company. The limestone deposits under your property are worth millions. The implications hit Hank like cold water. Wheeler's development talk had been misdirection, designed to conceal the true value of what lay beneath the lake. The 30% increase in purchase offers suddenly made sense. Highland wasn't paying for rural real estate. They were buying access to a geological treasure that would transform the entire area. A second envelope contained correspondence between Southwestern Quarry and various property owners in the region, revealing a systematic effort to acquire mineral rights for a massive extraction operation. Most landowners had signed agreements without understanding the full scope of what they were approving, but the most stunning discovery was a letter addressed to Ray, dated 2 years before his death, offering him a substantial sum for exclusive mining rights to his property. Ray's response, carbon-copied and filed with meticulous care, was a polite but firm refusal that cited environmental concerns and his commitment to sustainable land use. He knew, Hank said, studying the correspondence with growing amazement. Ray knew about the limestone all along. A note in Ray's handwriting, clipped to the quarry company's offer, explained his reasoning. Short-term profit versus long-term sustainability. Mom and Dad would have chosen the lake. So do I. That Ray had knowingly chosen fish farming over mineral wealth reframed everything Hank thought he understood about his brother's priorities. This hadn't been a naive dreamer pursuing impractical schemes. This had been a deliberate choice to preserve something valuable over extracting something profitable. The phone calls started within hours of the survey document's arrival, suggesting that Highland Development had been monitoring the county clerk's office for any activity related to mineral rights research. Wheeler's tone was noticeably cooler when he called to schedule an immediate meeting. Mr. Morrison, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about our previous discussions. I'd like to clarify our position regarding your property. The meeting took place at Murphy's feed store, neutral ground that quickly filled with more people than a routine real estate discussion would normally attract. Wheeler arrived with 2 associates and a briefcase full of documents that laid out Southwestern Quarry's complete development plans for the region. The financial numbers were staggering. Mineral rights alone would provide Hank with more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. The quarry operation would bring hundreds of jobs to Milbrook, reverse decades of economic decline, and position the town for sustainable growth based on industrial production rather than agricultural uncertainty. This represents the largest economic development opportunity in the county's history, Wheeler explained to the assembled crowd that included most of the town council, several business owners, and a surprising number of residents who'd never shown interest in the lake project. But quarry operations would require extensive infrastructure development that would fundamentally alter the landscape for miles around. Heavy truck traffic, processing facilities, and the gradual excavation of the limestone deposits would transform the quiet rural area into an industrial zone. What happens to the lake? Asked Dr. Martinez, who'd driven down from Austin when she heard about the meeting. The quarry operation would require that water for processing, Wheeler replied matter-of-factly. The current lake would be modified to serve industrial needs. The room divided along predictable lines. Older residents who remembered the town's more prosperous past saw the quarry as salvation from economic decline. Younger families worried about environmental impact and quality of life changes. Newcomers like the environmental volunteers supported preservation, while established business owners calculated potential profits from increased industrial activity. Mayor Patricia Hendricks, Bill's wife, asked the question that hung over the entire discussion. "Mr. Morrison, what are your intentions regarding this offer?" All eyes turned to Hank, who found himself representing not just his own interests, but the future direction of the entire community. Accept the quarry company's offer, and Milbrook would transform into an industrial town. Refuse, and the town might continue its slow economic decline while other communities captured the benefits of development. "I need time to consider all the implications," Hank said, which satisfied no one but avoided committing to either direction. The drive home was quiet, except for Rusty's labored breathing from the passenger seat. The dog had been showing his age more clearly in recent weeks. Slower walks, longer rest periods, and a reluctance to swim in the cooler water that suggested joint problems were limiting his mobility. That evening, as Hank sat by the lake watching the sunset reflect off water that might soon be diverted for industrial use, Rusty struggled to his feet from his usual resting spot and slowly made his way to the water's edge. The dog that had discovered the fish beneath the algae, that had guided the restoration work with instinctive understanding, stood motionless as fish rose to feed in the twilight. Dr. Martinez found them there an hour later, bringing test results that showed the lake's ecosystem had achieved remarkable stability. Fish populations were thriving, water quality remained excellent, and the natural filtration systems were functioning better than many commercial aquaculture operations. "Your brother created something extraordinary here," she said, settling beside. "Ink on the grass. From a scientific perspective, destroying it would be tragic. But I understand the economic pressures you're facing." "Ray chose fish over money," Hank replied. "But Ray didn't have medical bills, mortgage payments, and an uncertain future at 63. What do you think he'd want you to do?" Hank pulled Ray's letter from his pocket, reading it again by the fading light. His brother's words about creating something that would last beyond their lifetimes took on new meaning when weighed against the immediate financial security that mineral rights would provide. "I think he'd want me to make the right choice," Hank said finally. "I'm just not sure what that is anymore." Sarah arrived as full darkness settled over the lake, bringing news that Highland Development had scheduled a town hall meeting for the following week to present their complete development proposal to the community. The meeting would include economic impact studies, environmental assessments, and detailed plans for transforming Milbrook into a regional industrial center. "They're moving fast," Sarah said. "Once public opinion solidifies around economic benefits, it'll be much harder to preserve alternatives." Sitting between the two women who'd become his closest advisors, watching Rusty rest his aging body beside the water that had given him such purpose, Hank felt the weight of decisions that would affect far more than his personal situation. The lake represented 8 years of his brother's life work, the hopes of a struggling community, and the dreams of people who believed sustainable development was possible. But it also represented the difference between financial security and continued uncertainty, between immediate prosperity and long-term environmental health, between honoring Ray's vision and accepting the practical realities of economic survival. The choice, when it came, would define not just Hank's future, but the legacy he left behind. And time, like Rusty's health and the town's patience, was running shorter than he'd hoped. Standing in the darkness beside the lake that held 10,000 fish and countless possibilities, Hank realized that some decisions couldn't be made through careful analysis and practical consideration. Some choices required faith in values that couldn't be measured in immediate returns. The question was whether he had the courage to follow his brother's example, or whether decades of practical thinking had made him too cautious to believe in anything beyond financial certainty. The community petition began as Sarah's idea, but it quickly evolved into something larger than anyone had anticipated. What started as a simple document supporting lake preservation became a grassroots organizing effort that revealed deep divisions within Milbrook about progress, tradition, and the kind of future the town wanted to create. Sarah spent the week following Highland Development's announcement, visiting every household in the county, armed with photographs of the restored lake, copies of Dr. Martinez's scientific assessments, and Ray's detailed documentation of the aquaculture project's success. Her approach was methodical and respectful, listening to concerns as much as presenting arguments. People need to understand what they'd be losing, she explained to Hank as they worked late into the evening preparing materials for the town hall meeting. The quarry company is promising jobs and prosperity, but they're not talking about the permanent changes to water quality, air quality, and community character. The petition itself filled 17 pages with signatures, comments, and personal statements from residents who'd come to see the lake as more than just Hank's private restoration project. But more significantly, it included detailed economic projections showing how sustainable aquaculture and ecotourism could provide long-term benefits without environmental destruction. Dr. Martinez had contributed scientific backing for these projections, working with colleagues from Texas A&M to develop a comprehensive plan for expanding the lake's educational and economic potential. Their proposal included partnerships with local schools, university research programs, and sustainable agriculture initiatives that could position Milbrook as a model for rural economic development. What Ray started here could be replicated in dozens of communities, Dr. Martinez explained during one of their planning sessions. Sustainable aquaculture provides food security, environmental benefits, and economic opportunity without the boom-bust cycles of extractive industries. But Highland Development had been equally busy, and their counter-campaign emphasized immediate financial benefits that would transform individual lives as well as community prospects. James Wheeler had arranged for Southwestern Quarries executives to meet privately with business owners, city council members, and anyone facing financial difficulties that mineral royalties could solve. The pressure on Hank intensified daily. Wheeler's offers escalated beyond the original mineral rights payments to include consulting fees, management positions, and guarantees that would ensure financial security for the rest of his life. The proposals were designed to address every practical concern that might motivate someone to preserve the lake instead of accepting development. Think about your retirement, Wheeler urged during one of his increasingly frequent phone calls. Think about medical expenses, unexpected emergencies, the freedom that financial independence would provide. Your brother's fish project is admirable, but it can't offer the security that mineral development guarantees. The most difficult conversations came from neighbors and longtime acquaintances who saw Hank's decision as affecting their own futures. Murphy approached him at the feed store, with numbers showing how quarry employment would boost sales for every business in town. Bill Hendricks stopped by the property to explain how his children might finally have reasons to move back to Milbrook if good jobs became available. "I'm not trying to pressure you," Bill said, as they stood beside the lake watching fish rise to feed in the evening light. "But my grandson's been talking about becoming an engineer, and quarry operations would give him opportunities right here at home instead of having to move to Dallas or Houston." These personal appeals cut deeper than Wheeler's financial offers, because they came from people Hank had known for decades, people whose struggles and hopes he understood intimately. Rural communities across Texas were losing young people to urban opportunities, and the quarry represented a chance to reverse in the trend through local economic development. Rusty's health provided an unexpected counterpoint to the escalating pressure. After weeks of declining energy and mobility, the old dog experienced what Dr. Simmons called a remarkable recovery following treatment for arthritis and a carefully managed diet adjustment. Within days, Rusty was swimming again, guiding fish with renewed enthusiasm and displaying the alertness that had made him such an essential partner in the lake's restoration. Sometimes old bodies just need the right kind of care, Dr. Simmons observed as they watched Rusty paddle energetically through the clear water. Age doesn't have to mean decline if the underlying systems are healthy. The veterinarian's comment resonated with broader questions about community health and sustainability. Was Milbrook's economic decline inevitable, or could the right kind of development restore vitality without destroying the characteristics that made the town worth preserving? Hank found himself spending hours at the lake during the final week before the town hall meeting, trying to reconcile practical concerns with the growing sense that Ray's vision represented something valuable, beyond immediate financial considerations. The fish that Rusty had first discovered beneath the algae had multiplied into a thriving ecosystem that produced food, provided education, and demonstrated possibilities for sustainable development. But the lake also represented isolation from broader economic forces that were transforming rural Texas, whether individual communities participated willingly or not. Highland Development's research showed that mineral extraction would occur in surrounding counties, regardless of Milbrook's decision, potentially leaving the town economically marginalized if it chose preservation over participation. Sarah's organizing efforts had attracted support from environmental groups, sustainable agriculture advocates, and university researchers who saw the lake as a valuable demonstration site. But they'd also revealed the extent to which the community was divided along generational, economic, and philosophical lines that made consensus difficult. "We're not just choosing between a lake and a quarry," Sarah observed as they reviewed petition signatures and tried to predict voting patterns. "We're choosing between different visions of what rural communities should become in the 21st century. The night before the town hall meeting, Hank sat in Ray's barn office, surrounded by 8 years of meticulous documentation, financial projections, and correspondence that revealed his brother's gradual transformation from impractical dreamer to thoughtful steward of land and water resources. Ray's final entries showed plans for expanding the aquaculture operation, developing educational programs, and creating partnerships that would provide sustainable income while preserving environmental health. Year 8 conclusions. Ray had written in his careful handwriting, "System has exceeded all expectations for production, sustainability, and educational value. Ready to begin community integration phase. Primary objective: demonstrate that rural economic development can enhance, rather than replace natural systems." Reading his brother's words, Hank finally understood that Ray's choice hadn't been between immediate profit and long-term vision. It had been between extractive thinking and regenerative thinking, between seeing land as a resource to be consumed and seeing it as a system to be stewarded. The lake represented more than successful fish farming or environmental preservation. It represented proof that rural communities could participate in modern economic development while maintaining the characteristics that made them worth preserving in the first place. But understanding Ray's vision didn't automatically resolve the practical pressures that made mineral development so attractive to people facing immediate financial challenges. Hank's own situation remained precarious enough that Highland Development's offers would solve problems that sustainable aquaculture might never address. Dr. Martinez arrived early on the morning of the town hall meeting, bringing final documentation for the lake's potential designation as a state demonstration site. The recognition would provide funding for educational programs, research support, and technical assistance that could help expand the project's economic impact. Official designation wouldn't prevent mineral development, she explained as they prepared presentation materials, but it would establish the lake's scientific value and create legal protections that would make quarry operations more complicated and expensive. Sarah had organized the presentation like a courtroom argument, with supporting evidence, expert testimony, and visual documentation that would help community members understand both the immediate benefits and long-term implications of their choice. The petition had grown to over 300 signatures, representing nearly half the county's registered voters, but Wheeler had prepared equally thoroughly, bringing economic impact studies, employment projections, and testimonials from other communities that had benefited from quarry development. His presentation would emphasize immediate improvements to personal finances, community infrastructure, and regional economic competitiveness. As the afternoon of the meeting approached, Hank found himself standing beside the lake with Rusty, watching fish move through water so clear that every detail of the bottom structure was visible. The transformation from stagnant green pool to thriving ecosystem had required patience, knowledge, and faith in natural processes that weren't immediately apparent. The same qualities, he realized, would be required for whatever decision the community made about its future. Short-term thinking might provide immediate benefits, but long-term prosperity would require the same careful attention to underlying systems that had made the lake restoration successful. The question wasn't whether Milbrook could afford to preserve the lake, but whether it could afford to destroy the only successful model it had for development that enhanced rather than replaced natural systems. Standing in the late afternoon light, watching Rusty guide fish through water that reflected both sky and possibility, Hank finally understood what Ray had been trying to tell him in that final letter. Some choices couldn't be made based on immediate practical considerations alone. Some decisions required faith in values that would outlast the people making them. The town hall meeting would determine not just the lake's future, but whether Milbrook had the courage to choose regeneration over extraction, community over profit, and legacy over expedience. As the sun set behind the hills that surrounded the lake, Hank realized he'd already made his choice. The question now was whether his neighbors would make the same one. The Milbrook Community Center hadn't seen crowds like this since the high school state championship game 15 years ago. Folding chairs filled every available space, and people lined the walls when seating ran out. The tension was palpable. Neighbors who'd known each other for decades sat on opposite sides of an invisible divide that split the room between those supporting lake preservation and those favoring quarry development. Hank stood at the front of the room beside a card table, displaying his presentation materials, feeling more nervous than he had since his wedding day. 38 years ago, Sarah had helped him organize the evidence methodically, photographs showing the lake's transformation, water quality test results, fish population counts, and Dr. Martinez's scientific assessments. But the centerpiece was a simple glass jar filled with crystal-clear water taken from the lake that morning. "This is what we're really talking about tonight," Hank began, holding up the water sample so everyone could see it. 6 months ago, this was green soup that nobody thought was worth anything. Tonight, it's home to 10,000 fish and proof that we can restore life to places everyone had written off as dead. He'd practiced the presentation for days, but standing before 200 of his neighbors, many of whom had never seen him speak publicly before, Hank found himself abandoning his prepared remarks in favor of something more personal. "My brother Ray spent 8 years working on this lake, while most of us thought he was wasting his time. I thought he was wasting his time, but Ray understood something. It took me 63 years to learn that sometimes the most practical thing you can do is believe in possibilities instead of limitations." The photographs told the story better than words. Before and after shots showed the dramatic transformation from algae-covered stagnation to clear water teeming with visible fish. Dr. Martinez's charts documented water quality improvements, biodiversity increases, and production levels that exceeded commercial aquaculture standards. "This isn't just about fish," Hank continued, surprising himself with his growing confidence. "It's about proving that rural communities can participate in economic development without destroying the things that make them special. Ray's Lake produces food, provides education, and creates jobs, just different kinds of jobs than we're used to thinking about. Carol Voss from the Environmental Alliance presented the economic projections that Sarah had helped develop. Sustainable. Aquaculture combined with ecotourism could provide steady employment for 15 to 20 people, generate revenue through educational programs, and position Milbrook as a destination for visitors interested in environmental stewardship. The lake project has already attracted university research partnerships and state recognition, Carol explained. These relationships create opportunities for grant funding, educational programs, and technical assistance that would benefit the entire community. But the most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources. Mrs. Patterson, the postmaster, stood to describe how the lake project had given her hope that Milbrook could attract young families instead of just watching them leave. Tom Bradley, whose feed store had been struggling for years, talked about increased business from visitors who came to see the restoration work. People drive down from Austin on weekends just to look at what Hank's accomplished, Tom said. They buy lunch at the cafe, gas at Murphy's, and supplies at my store. It's not oil boom money, but it's steady, and it's based on something we can be proud of. Dr. Martinez provided scientific context that transformed local success into broader significance. The lake's ecosystem design could be replicated in dozens of communities facing similar economic challenges, creating a model for development that enhanced rather than replaced natural systems. Then, James Wheeler took the floor. His presentation was polished, professional, and devastating in its directness. Charts showed tax revenue projections that would double the county's budget within 5 years. Employment figures included not just quarry jobs, but support positions in transportation, equipment maintenance, and administrative services. Personal income calculations demonstrated how mineral royalties would provide financial security for every property owner in the affected area. We're talking about transforming Milbrook from a struggling rural community into a regional economic center, Wheeler said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who delivered similar presentations in dozens of communities. Mr. Morrison's fish project is admirable, but it employs 20 people. Quarry operations would employ 200 people with wages that support families and build futures. The counter-presentation included testimonials from other communities that had embraced mineral development. Video messages from mayors, business owners, and workers showed thriving towns where quarry operations had funded new schools, improved infrastructure, and provided opportunities for young people to build careers without leaving home. The choice isn't between good and bad, Wheeler concluded. It's between gradual decline and dramatic improvement. Milbrook can either participate in the economic growth that's transforming Texas, or it can be left behind by communities that were willing to embrace change. The room erupted as soon as Wheeler finished speaking. Voices rose in heated exchanges that revealed philosophical divisions running deeper than anyone had anticipated. Older residents who remembered the town's more prosperous past clashed with newcomers who'd moved to Milbrook specifically to escape urban development pressures. "You're talking about destroying everything that makes this place worth living in," shouted Margaret Chen, Sarah's aunt, from the back of the room. "And you're talking about poverty and decline," Bill Hendricks responded from the front. "My kids can't afford to live here on the jobs that exist now." Mayor Patricia Hendricks banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to a meeting that was revealing fractures in the community that had been building for years. The lake and quarry had become symbols of competing visions for rural America: preservation versus development, environmental stewardship versus economic opportunity, community character versus financial progress. As the shouting continued, Hank looked down at the jar of clear water in his hands, remembering Rusty's first dive into murky green algae and the silver flash of life that had started everything. The water sample represented more than ecosystem health. It represented faith in renewal, belief in possibilities that couldn't be measured in immediate returns. The question now was whether that faith could survive the practical pressures that made Wheeler's offer so compelling to people facing uncertain futures in a changing world. The mayor's gavel couldn't restore order to a room where 20 years of community tensions had finally found expression. Neighbors who'd maintained polite relationships despite philosophical differences were now arguing openly about progress, tradition, and the kind of future they wanted their children to inherit. Hank stood at the front of the increasingly chaotic meeting, still holding the jar of clear lake water, watching relationships fracture along lines that wouldn't easily heal, regardless of how the evening ended. But as the shouting reached its peak, something unexpected happened. Rusty appeared at the community center door. The old dog had somehow escaped from Hank's truck and made his way into the building, moving slowly but purposefully through the crowd, until he reached the front of the room. His presence had an immediate calming effect. People stopped shouting to watch as he settled beside Hank's feet with the dignified patience of an elder who'd seen enough conflict to know when intervention was needed. "Maybe we should listen to someone who actually knows the lake," called out a voice from the middle of the room, producing scattered laughter that broke the tension enough for people to remember they were neighbors, not enemies. Mayor Hendricks seized the moment to restore parliamentary procedure. "Mr. Morrison, as the property owner, you have the right to make a final statement before we vote." Hank hadn't planned to speak again, but standing beside Rusty in front of 200 people who were waiting for his words, he found himself thinking about Ray's letter, about legacy and second chances, about the difference between surviving and thriving. 20 years ago, my brother and I had an argument that never got resolved," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the now quiet room. "Ray wanted to save our family farm, and I wanted to sell it before we lost everything. We were both right, and we were both wrong, but we were too stubborn to admit it." He paused, looking out at faces he'd known for decades, people who'd struggled through economic changes, family losses, and the gradual erosion of the community they'd grown up in. Ray spent the last 8 years of his life proving that we didn't have to choose between being practical and being hopeful. His lake produces food and income, but it also produces something harder to measure, proof that renewal is possible, that things we think are dead can come back to life if we're willing to invest in them. Hank held up the water sample again, and this time, people leaned forward to see it more clearly. "Highland Development is offering us money for what's under the ground, but Ray left us something more valuable, proof of what's possible above the ground, if we have the patience to cultivate it. The quarry would provide jobs for a generation, maybe 2, but what we've built at the lake could provide opportunity for generations to come." The room remained silent as Hank continued, his words carrying the weight of decisions that would outlast everyone present. "I'm not asking you to choose between prosperity and preservation. I'm asking you to choose between extraction and cultivation, between consuming what we have and growing what we could become. My brother believed this community was worth the long investment. Tonight, I'm asking you to believe it too." When Mayor Hendricks called for the vote, the result surprised everyone, including Hank. The motion to support lake preservation and oppose mineral development passed by a margin of 147 to 23, with most of the opposing votes coming from people who abstained rather than actively supporting the quarry. The tally sheet that recorded the vote would become a historical document, marking the moment when Milbrook chose regeneration over extraction, community vision over individual profit, and faith in sustainable development over the certainty of industrial income. James Wheeler's response to the vote was more gracious than anyone had expected. "Southwestern Quarry respects the community's decision," he said as the meeting concluded. "We believe mineral development would have benefited Milbrook, but we understand that communities have the right to determine their own futures." His acceptance of defeat with professional dignity helped heal some of the divisions the evening had exposed, allowing people to leave the community center with a sense that democracy had functioned properly even when producing disappointing results for some participants. The celebration that followed was spontaneous and inclusive. Word spread quickly that everyone was invited to the lake for what Sarah called a community appreciation gathering. And by sunset, over 100 people had assembled along the shoreline to see the restored ecosystem that had sparked such passionate debate. Children who'd never seen the lake before waded into the clear water, squealing with delight as fish swam around their feet. Adults who'd opposed the project found themselves admiring the engineering that had created such a thriving system from what they'd remembered as stagnant green soup. Dr. Martinez provided impromptu education about aquaculture techniques, while Sarah organized tours that explained the lake's history and future potential. Local families brought picnic dinners, transforming the gathering into a community celebration that bridged the philosophical divisions the meeting had revealed. As darkness settled over the lake, Rusty made his final contribution to the evening. Despite his age and recent health problems, he waded into the water one more time, swimming slowly but steadily toward the center of the lake where fish rose to feed in the gathering dusk. "Look at that old dog go," someone said, and the entire gathering fell silent to watch Rusty's peaceful progress through water that reflected stars and possibilities in equal measure. When he finally paddled back to shore, shaking himself with satisfaction, the applause was genuine and sustained, recognition for the dog whose instincts had started everything, whose faith in hidden life beneath murky surfaces had proven more reliable than human skepticism. Standing beside the lake that had transformed from burden to blessing, surrounded by neighbors who'd chosen hope over fear, Hank felt something he hadn't experienced since his parents' death, the deep satisfaction of belonging to a community that was worth the effort required to sustain it. 6 months after the town hall meeting, the sign that had been installed at the entrance to the property read, "Green Bowl Aquaculture and Education Center," in hand-carved letters that Sarah had commissioned from a local craftsman. The sign represented more than a name change. It marked the transformation of what locals had once called worthless land into something that drew visitors from across Texas and beyond. The morning routine that had once involved feeding 3 horses and worrying about bills now included checking water quality, coordinating educational tours, and managing a small but profitable business that provided fresh fish to restaurants in Austin and San Antonio. Hank moved through these tasks with the same deliberate efficiency he'd always brought to ranch work, but with an energy and purpose that had been missing for years. Rusty, now 13 but enjoying what Dr. Simmons called exceptional health for his age, maintained his role as the lake's unofficial supervisor. The old dog had become something of a celebrity among visiting school groups, who delighted in hearing about his discovery of the fish and watching him demonstrate his unique ability to guide them through the clear water. "He's got more energy than dogs half his age," Sarah observed as they watched Rusty lead a group of elementary students on an impromptu lesson in fish behavior. She'd taken a leave of absence from the library to help manage the education center's growing programs, and her expertise in research and organization had proven invaluable in developing curriculum and coordinating with universities. The business side of the operation had exceeded everyone's expectations. Dr. Martinez's connections with sustainable agriculture programs had led to partnerships with 3 restaurants that featured green bowl fish on their menus, marketing the products as locally raised, environmentally sustainable protein. The premium prices justified the careful, small-scale production methods that Ray had developed. But it was the education center that had captured Hank's imagination most completely. Groups of agriculture students, environmental science classes, and community organizations made regular visits to learn about sustainable aquaculture techniques. The program had expanded to include workshops on water management, ecosystem design, and rural economic development that attracted participants from across the region. Ray would have loved this, Hank told Dr. Martinez during one of her monthly site visits. They were standing beside the demonstration tanks where visitors could observe fish behavior up close, watching a group of high school students collect water samples for a chemistry experiment. "He'd be proud of what you've accomplished, Doctor," Martinez replied, "but I think he'd be most pleased that you've made it about community rather than just production." That was always his vision, proving that sustainable practices could bring people together rather than divide them. The community integration had been more successful than anyone had anticipated. Volunteer work days had become monthly traditions, with neighbors contributing labor for maintenance projects, habitat improvements, and facility expansions. The lake had become a gathering place for church groups, family reunions, and informal social events that strengthened relationships within the community. Murphy's feed store now carried specialized aquaculture supplies, and Tom Bradley had expanded his business to include equipment rentals for visiting researchers and educational groups. The economic impact was modest but real, steady income that supported local businesses without the boom-bust volatility of extractive industries. Hank's relationship with Sarah had evolved naturally from partnership to romance, built on shared work and mutual respect rather than dramatic gestures or passionate declarations. They'd moved in together quietly, combining households with the practical efficiency of two mature people who'd learned to value compatibility over excitement. "You know," Sarah said one evening as they sat on the dock that community volunteers had built for easier lake access, "I never thought I'd end up with a fish farmer. And I never thought I'd end up with a librarian who could negotiate with state agencies and organize educational programs." Hank replied, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and amber. The transformation of their personal lives mirrored the lake's evolution from problem to opportunity, from burden to blessing. At 64, Hank had discovered that starting over was possible at any age, that new purposes could emerge from unexpected places, and that communities could choose regeneration over decline if they had the courage to invest in long-term thinking. The evening ritual of checking the fish and securing equipment had replaced his old routine of worrying about bills and wondering how to make ends meet. Financial concerns hadn't disappeared completely, but they'd been overshadowed by the satisfaction of meaningful work and the security that came from having multiple income sources rather than depending on unpredictable markets. As autumn approached, and the water temperature began its seasonal decline, Hank found himself thinking about cycles, the natural rhythms that governed fish reproduction, water chemistry, and ecosystem health, but also the human cycles of loss and renewal, isolation and connection, despair and hope. Standing beside the lake in the gathering dusk, watching Rusty make his evening patrol of the shoreline with the satisfied air of a job well done, Hank reflected on the chain of events that had brought him to this point. His brother's death had seemed like another loss in a life that had included too many endings. The inherited property had appeared to be a burden that would complicate an already difficult situation, but hidden beneath the surface of what everyone had dismissed as worthless, life had been waiting to flourish. Ray's vision had needed only someone willing to look beyond appearances, to invest in possibilities rather than accept limitations, to choose cultivation over extraction. The lake that had once been called the Green Bowl, in mocking reference to its stagnant condition, now earned the name as a symbol of abundance and renewal. 10,000 fish swam in waters that supported not just aquatic life, but human community, educational opportunity, and economic sustainability. Sometimes life Gives you a second chance when you least expect it, Hank thought, remembering the words that had started his journey toward understanding. And sometimes that chance comes from the most unlikely place you'd ever imagine. But perhaps the most surprising discovery was that the worthless inheritance had never been worthless at all. It had just been waiting for someone who understood. That the most valuable gifts often come disguised as problems, requiring patience, faith, and the wisdom to see potential where others saw only difficulty. As the stars began to appear over the quiet water where fish rose to feed and dreams took shape in ripples that spread far beyond their origins, Hank knew that Ray's legacy was secure, and that sometimes the best way to honor the past was to build something worthy of the future.